जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा। विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा। तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे। गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे।
It is my pride to welcome the webinar organizing secretary, research scholar, Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, Mr. Isa Ali Muhammad Ali.
Ladies and gentlemen, to reach every corner of the world. In this regard, translation becomes all
Dr. Isa, your voice is breaking. We can't hear you.
Hello, do you hear me now? Hello,
Okay, okay.
do you hear me?
Okay, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and very good morning, one and all. We're living in a world shrunk into a global village where knowledge explodes and travels overseas in a second. Language should not be a barrier preventing this knowledge to reach every corner of the world. In this regard, translation becomes all the more significant than ever. Therefore, an international conference on translation theory and techniques, where experts, scholars, and researchers around the world pour in their ideas, concepts, and notions is the need of the hour. In my capacity as the organizing secretary to the webinar, it has been a privilege to deliver the welcome address in the 3-day international webinar on 5 T's. Translation theory, tools, techniques, and tactics, conducted by the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, India, in association with Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, Sana'a University, Yemen, and the School of Languages and Literature, Farooq College, Calicut, Kerala, India. First of all, I extend hearty welcome to Professor S.A. Shanavaz, the organizing convener and the head of the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, India, without whom this webinar would have been a distant dream. Next, I would like to extend wholehearted welcome to
Lisa, we can't hear you.
someone muted me. First of all, I extend hearty welcome to Professor S.A. Shanavaz, the organizing convener and the head of the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, India, without whom this webinar would have been a distant dream. Next, I would like to extend wholehearted welcome to Professor P.P. Ajay Kumar, the Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, University of Kerala, India. He has been so kind to inaugurate the webinar despite his busy schedule. We are lucky to receive Professor Al-Qasim Muhammad Abbas, Rector of Sana'a University, as our special guest. I welcome you, sir, to this webinar. The chief guest of the program is really the most apt person to adorn the position. I welcome Professor Abdurrahman Abdurrabbah, professor at Sana'a University, Yemen. Our guest of honor is a man of honor who has carved his own niche in the field of education. I welcome Dr. K.M. Nasir, Principal, Farooq College, Calicut, India, to this webinar. I welcome Professor Hassan Syed Ghazala, Professor of Translation and Stylistics, Al Qura University, Mecca Al Mukarrama, Saudi Arabia, who has agreed to deliver the keynote address in spite of his hectic schedule. We have been fortunate enough to be blessed with the presence of Professor Cristiano Nord, the distinguished German translation theorist and practitioner, who will deliver the special address. I welcome you, Madam, to this function. Theme presentation is carried out by Dr. S. Prema, the webinar coordinator and assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, India. Dr. S. Prema has always been our source of inspiration with her unparalleled guidance. I welcome you, ma'am, to this program. I welcome Dr. Ubaid VPC, another webinar organizing secretary and assistant professor, Department of English, Farooq College, Calicut, India, who is proposing the vote of thanks in this inaugural function. Let me welcome both Dr. Sajita M.A., another webinar coordinator and chairperson, School of Languages and head of the Department of English, Farooq College, Calicut, India, and Dr. Muhammad, officer and head, Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, Sana'a University, Yemen, who are giving the felicitations in this auspicious occasion. I would like to extend my warm welcome to all the plenary speakers who are the real instruments of the success of this webinar. On behalf of the organizing committee and on my personal behalf, I welcome Dr. Abdul Hamid Shuja, Associate Professor, Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, Sana'a University, Yemen. Dr. Walid Al-Amri, Associate Professor, Department of Languages and Translation, Taipa University, Medina, Saudi Arabia. Dr. Priya K. Nair, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Tirasas College, Kerala. Dr. Safa Al-Haddad, Assistant Professor, Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, Sana'a University, Yemen. Dr. Ahmed Abdul Tawab Sharafuddin, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Minovia University, Egypt. Dr. Ikhlas Al-Kananiwa, the winner of the first prize of Sheikh Hamad Translation Award, Amman, Jordan. Dr. Dana Awad, Associate Professor, Lebanese University, Lebanon. Dr. Badri Zubair, Associate Professor in the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Dr. K.M. Sharif, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Calicut, Kerala, and Dr. Muhammad Al-Akili, Assistant Professor, Sana'a University, Yemen. I have to welcome those professors who have been so supportive and agreed to chair the technical sessions. On behalf of the organizing committee and on my personal behalf, I welcome Professor Yasin Ashraf, former head of the Department of English, Farooq College, Kerala, Professor Rajendran, visiting professor, Amrita University, India, Dr. Abdullah Ahmed Minham, senior lecturer, Faculty of Languages and Translation, Al-Jamia Al-Islamia, Kerala, Dr. Abdul Wadud Al-Nuzaili, Assistant Professor, Department of Translation, Sana'a University, Yemen, Dr. Sabik M.K., Assistant Professor, MES Mambad College, Autonomous, Kerala. Dr. N. Shamnad, Assistant Professor, University College, Kerala. Professor N. Suresh, Director, Center for Translation Studies, University of Kerala. Dr. Shahina A.K., Head, PG Department of English, KAHM, Unity Women's College, Kerala. Dr. H. Purnima, Professor of Sanskrit, Sri Sanskaracharya, University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala. And Dr. Muhammad Ali E.K., Assistant Professor, Department of English, Farooq College, Autonomous, Calicut, India. Last but not least, it's with a great pleasure that I welcome all the paper presenters whose contributions are very essential for our webinar and for the translation industry. I welcome all the participants across the globe who can make the webinar a grand success with their active participation in the deliberations. I welcome all of you once again on behalf of the organizing committee and on my personal behalf. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It gives us immense pleasure to invite Once again, thank you, Mr. Isa. It gives us immense pleasure to invite our beloved teacher, Dr. Prema, Hypnoid Coordinator, Assistant Professor, Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, to present the theme of our webinar. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Thank you. Respected Professor Ajay Kumar sir, our Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, respected dignitaries across the world, professors, teachers, participants, and dear friends. In the beginning, according to the Holy Bible, we humans were speaking a language, but God confused our tongue when we were building the Tower of Babel. But we human, the most beautiful creation of God, could transcend the confusion of our tongues by translation. Translation is human transcendence to rise above the human limitations across languages. We have been translating each other, therefore we are connected across. God himself is more benefited out of our act of translation. See, the Bible, Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita, all holy texts were translated into many languages across the world. Nations were built by translation, internationals were built by translation, great literature becomes great by translation, religions are spread across the world by translation. Humanity is translating each other. While I am speaking to you, I am translating myself to you all. Francis George Skinner, American literary critic, philosopher, and novelist, stated that without translation, we would be living in provinces bordering on silence. Therefore, translation is an important tool used to interconnect communities that have different languages and cultures. Translation studies is an academic interdiscipline dealing with the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of translation, interpreting, and etc. According to Larson, good theory is based on information gained from practice, and good practice is based on carefully worked out theory. Therefore, both theory and practice are interdependent. The 3-day international webinar on 5 T's, translation, theory, tools, techniques, and tactics, focuses on how translation procedures, techniques, methods, and etc. can help the practicing translators overcome the linguistic and cultural problems encountered by them when translating from the source language into the target language. As there are problematic issues in translation process, especially between languages that belong to different language families and different cultures, the theory should provide solutions to those problems. Our keynote speaker, Professor Hassan Ghazala, in his book entitled Translation as Problems and Solutions, has rightly pointed out that any translation problem demands a solution. Without a solution, there is no great use in pointing a translation problem. Indeed, without solutions to transform translation problem, we stop translating altogether. The 3-day webinar, international webinar on 5 T's, can touch upon many different areas such as challenges of translation, transcreation, translation of literature, translation of science, translation of divine books, corpus-based translation, translation quality assessment, oral translation, teaching through translation, importance of translation training, competence of translators, translating, culture, and etc. I would like to end up my talk with a quote from the well-known translation theorist and practitioner who is with us today, Professor Christina Nord. A theory of translation can be embedded in a theory of human activity, action or activity. The parameters of action theory may help to explain some aspect of translation. Let us build the unforgotten Bible for the coming 3 days by sharing our experience on translation, translations, translated and untranslated, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful words. Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful words. I now call upon the webinar convener, Professor and Head in the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, for the presidential address. Dr. S.A. Shanavas, kindly start your presidential address.
الرحمن الرحيم ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف أنفسكم وأموالكم إن في لآيات لقوم عالمين. And of his side is the creation of the heaven and the earth, and is the diversity of your language and your color. Indeed, in that you are Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
And of his signs is the creation of the heaven and the earth, and the diversity of your language and your color. Indeed, in that are signs of those knowledge. It is in the Quran, Al-Rum 22. That means the chapter 30, 22. ആകാശഭൂമികളുടെ സൃഷ്ടിപ്പിലും ഭാഷയിലും നിറത്തിലുമുള്ള നിങ്ങളുടെ വ്യത്യാസം ദൈവിക ദൃഷ്ടാന്തം തന്നെ. അതിലും വിവരമുള്ളവർക്ക് ദൃഷ്ടാന്തങ്ങളുണ്ട്. Respected dignitaries, scholars, and professors, and dear participants, indeed, it is my pleasure to address you as a presidential candidate or presidential position in the inauguration of the 3-day international webinar on 5 T's. 5T means translation, theory, tools, techniques, and factors. I'm not going to speak much because our inaugural speaker, Professor Ajay Kumar sir, is having some immediate official task. So I invite him to deliver his inaugural speech, then I will speak. Thank you, sir. Professor Ajay Kumar sir.
Thank you very much for the invitation. The 3-day international webinar on 5 T's, translation, theory, tools, techniques, and tactics, is being organized jointly by the Department of Linguistics, University of Kerala, and the Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, University of Sana'a, Yemen, and the School of Languages, Farouk College. I congratulate the organizers for bringing together experts from different parts of the world to discuss a topic that is extremely relevant in the contemporary global scenario. We all know that translation has been one of the practices that brought different countries together, different languages together, different cultures together. And it is through translation that we came to understand the cultural, social, political, and racial peculiarities of divergent cultures, divergent nations. It is also true that translation has happened quite naturally between some of the cultures. Because even when we take the case of India, we have, even though we are one nation, we have multiple languages. And it's through translation that the different states or people belonging to different states came to understand the literatures and other social and political practices of people belonging to other states in India. And when we look at these translations closely, we find that it is between certain particular states that the translation happened profusely. For example, Kerala and Bengal has a lot of exchanges through translation, whereas there is very little between Kerala and Gujarat. So, and to a certain extent between Kerala and Karnataka, but at the same time, there is more intense connection through translation between Kerala and Bengal, even though the two states are situated at different parts of the country and distant locations of the country. So that proves that there is something that connects cultures, societies, and it is that connection that brings about translation in a huge manner. And most often we find that it is individual effort that resulted in translation more than institutional initiatives. Institutions are important, but at the same time, most often it is the hard work of some of the individuals that brought about very good translation. And in the case of Malayalam literature, we find that we have a lot of translated texts which are being read as original texts. A lot of very good translations which are very well accepted by the readers. So that shows that translation, even though it has limits, even though it has limitations of several sorts, it will also be accepted, and it can also be become popular among readers, even though there is the difference in culture, difference in language, difference the ways of thought, etc., etc. So I think it is also important that we should promote translation between cultures that has not been in this sort of field, that means that has not been translated so far. And recently there have been several efforts of that sort to translate texts from various cultures, especially from Latin American languages, Latin America, Canada, Africa, Australia, etc. And we know that most of these texts are available in English. So translation becomes comparatively easy. And we find that such efforts will finally lead to a kind of bringing together of cultures, societies, and people. And that is extremely important in the contemporary period. So I hope that this webinar will discuss most of the important problems associated with the 5 Ts. And it is also true that these issues do not have do not have a proper easy solution for us. We know that the practice of translation and the theory of translation should go together. It should influence each other, because it is through practice that we arrive at theory, and it is through theory that we resolve the problems that originate out of the practice. So both should go together, hand in hand, and I hope that the webinar will discuss most of these issues and will contribute a lot in developing our understanding of translation in general. And I wish all success to the seminar, and I declare that the seminar is open. Thank you very much for the invitation.
We extend our sincere gratitude to Professor P.P. Ajay Kumar, Vice Chancellor, University of Kerala, for his inspiring words. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again. And I again invite Dr. S.A. Shanavas.
Just wait, please. You there. Okay.
I invite Dr. S.A. Shanavas, Head Department of Linguistics, to continue the presidential address. Thanks.
Professor Shanavas, we can't hear you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Now you're audible. You're audible now, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ajay Kumar sir, for your wonderful presentation and enlightening the audience.
Sorry, sir. We are not able to hear you.
Hello?
Yes, sir. You're
Hello?
audible now. You're audible now.
Okay. I express my sincere thanks to Professor Ajay Kumar sir for his wonderful presentation and inaugurating the international webinar on translation. We have selected this title, 5 T's, Translation, Theory, Tool, Techniques and Tactics, as a title for this seminar because we are concerned about the translation theory, the translation tools, the translation techniques, and the translation tactics or the methods. As we all know, translation is one of the important area or one of the field where a lot of people are joining together. Even India government has established the translation mission, National Translation Mission, and as per the report by the India government Knowledge Commission, profession of translation will be an important one with lots of people will be engaged in translation as a profession, as a tool maker, as a theoretician and all these things, or even translation criticism or translation evaluation. Translation plays an important role and makes the difference when it comes to establishing relations between people, spreading ideas and delivering information worldwide. We live in a globalized world where numerous countries and cultures are connected. As I have pointed out from the Holy Quran, the God has created many languages and many colors among the people to understand each other. So as we have different languages, we need to have a language barrier solver, or that we call translation. Translation is happening since human beings are there with the different codes. If I have an idea, I have to translate that idea into verbal form, and the receiver has to get that verbal form or the gestures in his form. That is called, we used to call it as a translation proper or something like that. Nowadays, most of the culture we consume, whether it is a literature or cinema or television or music or news, comes from English speaking countries. Given that most of it is originally in our native language, there must be completed and qualified translator to translate or to subtitle all our favorite books, movies and TVs and all these things. Today, there is a body of knowledge about translation, which if applied to solving translation problem, we can contribute to a translator's training. Even though without expectations is translatable, there is no such a thing as perfect, ideal or correct translation. Here we are concentrating different aspects of translation, as the title says, theories of translation, problem of translation, localization and adaptation, audiovisual or media translation, transliteration, transcription, translation of literary works and non-literary works, or any other sort of things. Then translation, technical translation, machine translation, semiotic translation, translation of language, conservation, interdialect translation, and translatability and translation, aesthetics or assessment or criticism. Translation of classic and divine text, translation of political and ideological conflict, translation of language learning, translation and gender, translation, media and mass communication, translation and identity assessment, translation, loss, gain and divergence. Translation as an industry, economic enterprises, translation as a social cultural documentation, translation training, and so on. Then the philosophy of translation, translation as a technology, translation as a piece of narrative, translation, interpreting, translation using computer, and even letters to by translating your ideas into or converting the idea into a machine that is called machine readable, brain readable machines, or so on. The 3-day international webinar on 5Ts have invited eminent and expert speakers of translation studies from different corners of the world. It is our privilege to have Professor Christina Nord, a well-known German translation theorist and a practitioner, who has accepted our invitation to deliver the special address. We are also indebted to Professor Hassan Ghazali, a well-known professor of translation and stylistics, for accepting our invitation to deliver the keynote address. There are 20 plenary speakers who are specialists in translation theory studies. They belong to different countries like Germany, India, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, and so on. The plenary speakers will address different areas in their skill, such as translation, quality assessment, simultaneous interpretive skills, techniques of translation, teaching translation, translation between incompatible discourse tradition, competence of translators, translation as a cross-cultural narrative, etc. There are 10 technical sessions to be conducted during the 3 days. In each technical session, there will be plenary speakers and paper presenters. We have accepted more than around 47 papers, research papers, whose authors are from different countries such as Yemen, Oman, Morocco, UAE, Iraq, Algeria, etc. and etc. The purpose will address on different aspects, areas and aspects such as literary translation, scientific translation, ultra translatability, grammar translation method, machine translation, problems of teaching, translation, etc., etc. It is my pleasure to invite you all as the head of the department. I once again express my thanks to the supporting staff who have wholeheartedly or working their day and night to make this webinar grand success. And on behalf of the Department of Linguistics, this area will be, because this is an applied linguistic area, translation will play a major role in the coming era. With these few words, I come to conclusion, and thank you all for attending this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir,
Thank you.
for your wonderful words. I now invite Professor Al Qasim Muhammad Abbas, Rector, University of Sana, who is the special guest to deliver his speech.
It is my pleasure to be with you today. It is my pleasure to be with you today. I wish all of you the best. And I am so pleased to listen to you. The translation, it has become more and more important as the world come closer and closer, and the need to communicate and to understand each other. We have to get the best way and know each other and to know each other cultures. And the huge mass communication and the electronic development in this era, the machine translator has become important and important. I wish all of you the best, and I wish the sessions get an excellent result and conclusions to help and the way of translation. And thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your informative words. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your informative words. We are moving to our chief guest talk. We are honored to have with us Professor Abdul Rahman.
Excuse me. Mute it, please.
Yeah, we are honored to have with us Professor Abdul Rahman A. Abdurrab, Professor of English Translation Studies at the University of Sana, Yemen, as our chief guest for the inaugural session. He has more than 30 years of experience in translation and related research. With immense pleasure, we invite Professor Abdul Rahman A. Abdurrab to deliver a few words. Thank you.
I'm extremely pleased to be invited to this significant event focusing on translation theories, practices, tools, instruments, and all other related issues. I would like to express first my sincere thanks and appreciation to the three organizing institutions which played a significant role in ensuring the success of this event. It goes without saying that translation is an extremely important tool to further advance cross and global communication between and among people of different linguistic and cultural background. It is deemed essential to bridge the information gap between East and West. And I have the pleasure to have an input here, which could perhaps allow for further elaboration and discussion among participants in this extremely important and vital event. Translation may be defined as an act of text replacement. Having said this, the replacement of a text from one particular language system into another is an extremely complex process that takes into consideration a number of factors to ensure the sustainability of the community event between the source text writer and prospective readership and audience. It is also my understanding that the conference intends to focus on theories in translation. Along such lines, it would be fair to argue that any theory is meant primarily to inform practice, while translation theories are no exceptions. We tend to engage in the development of translation theories in order to inform the practice of translators. Translation theory is nothing more than a collection of generalizations about potential translating problems. And translation theory is meant to explain the nature of the difficulty that you are likely to encounter in attempting to transform a text creatively from one particular language system into another, and it offers potential solutions. It also goes without saying that there is no one single translation theory, procedure, or practice which is likely to solve all your translating problems. Every problem in translation may call for a specific solution. Now that makes it even more imperative for all scholars in translation to shed greater light on the importance of theory to the practice of translating. Now, we all understand the complexity of the translation scene, and it is my hope that participants in this event would shed light on this complexity and would simply inform the audience of means and ways to demystify such complexities. Here lies the importance of this event, and I will hope that participants will do the best in informing practitioners and the public at large of problems and issues that are likely to affect the translation scene in a bid to demystify the complexity of that scene. It is also fair to say that translation is a client-centered type of activity, and the translator will have to seriously take into consideration not only the essential message embedded in the source text, but to explore means and ways by means of which such message may be conveyed to his or her definable set of readership and audience in fulfillment of the requirement of acceptability, which is integral to the requirement of accuracy in translation. Once again, I would like to thank the organizing committees across those three institutions for playing a significant role in making this event see light. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that inspiring speech. We now have Dr. K.M. Nasir, Principal, Farooq College, Calicut, India, as the guest of honor. Due to some inconvenience, he cannot be online today, but we have a 3-minute audio clip that will be played now.
District figures representing different institutions, scholars present in the platform, and organizers of this grand academic fiesta, let me wish you all the warm greetings of Farooq College. We feel so proud to be an active collaborator of this 3-day international webinar, along with the reputed University of Sana'a of Yemen and the University of Kerala. It is really a matter of great pleasure that this 3-day webinar is going to explore the various nuances of the great genre of literature, namely translation. It is this genre that has paved the way for the transcending of parochial national borders through the translation of classical works of different nations and civilizations. The human emotions of love, sorrow, despondency, and disappointment remain the same across the national and cultural boundaries. It is just the language which reflects these emotions that differ. For the poet, the sound of the sea at the Dover and Aegean brings the same eternal note of sadness which reminds him of the ebb and flow of human misery. Languages, whether it is Arabic, English, Hindi, Tamil, or Malayalam, reflects the same human mind with its varied and complex states. It is here the genre of translation that acts as the vital connecting link between the different cultures, civilizations, and nationalities. Of course, there are scholarly meticulous conventions which states that what is lost through translation is the soul of the original work. But no doubt, it helps the human communities of different geographical locations to discover the warp and weft of kindredness that makes the entire human population on this globe a very vast single fabric of infinite colors and shades. Let me not trespass to these specialized scholarly domains which meticulously probe the technicalities of this genre. I hope this webinar will explore the various domains of the genre in detail and become a landmark in this direction. Wishing all success to this program, let me wind up my words. Thank you.
Dear all, we are very happy that our great scholar, Cristiano Nord, has joined us now. You're most welcome, our great scholar.
Hello. Good.
Hello. I said that our great scholar, Professor Cristiano Nord, has joined us now. You're most welcome, Professor Cristiano Nord.
I now invite Professor Christian Nord, translation theorist and practitioner. She was trained as a translator for Spanish and English at Heidelberg University and holds a PhD in Romance Studies. She has approximately 200 publications.
No, felicitations. No, felicitations. Felicitations, please.
She has approximately 200 publications to her credit. I now invite Professor Christian Nord for the special address.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. It's only the third time that I give a talk online, and I'm not yet quite used to this medium. Can you all hear me? Everything okay? Just
Yes.
give me a sign. Okay, thank you. Then my talk is about translating examples in a student textbook. And of course, as you might have suspected, it is from a functional point of view. So let us see whether this works. Okay. I have chosen a corpus and a sample. The corpus is the German book on the foundations of a general theory of translation by Katharina Reis and Hans Vermeer, first published in 1984, and it had not been translated into English until 2013. There is a Spanish translation which was published in 1996, but I'm not going to comment on this. So the English translation was published in 2013 with the title Towards a General Theory of Translational Action. It is now published by Routledge, and the first edition was published by St. Jerome's in Manchester. Of course, as a non-native speaker of English, I needed a reviewer, and that was Marina Dudenhofer, a British native speaker. The sample consists of the 288 examples of the book and their translation into English. So just to remind you of a few basic things. What is functionalism in translation studies? I would say it is a trend in modern translation studies based on Skopos theory by Hans Vermeer, first proposed in 1978, and then explained in the book I mentioned already. The Greek word skopos just means purpose. So not to use the German academic conventions where Greek words are really a must, we could call this theory a purpose theory. And the main hypothesis of this theory is that translating is a purposeful activity, and the communicative purpose of the translated or interpreted text guides the translator in their choice of translation method and strategy, and in the solution and every translation process. Okay. One of the most important aspects of this purpose is the intended audience. They will decide whether the text functions for them in the intended way. So the function is not in the text, but it is the receivers who determine which function or functions the text has for them in this particular moment of reception. So, as always, we start with a comparison of the source text and the target text profile. That is, what do we expect the target text to look like, and in what kind of situation will it be used? So I'm just comparing the German and the English text. The English text in the beginning is not yet there, so this is why I speak of profile. So the medium, the source text was published in 1984 in a series, we could say studies in linguistics. There was no series, no publisher specialized in translation studies at the time. So linguistics was the discipline which was nearest to translation studies. And the target text was going to be published by St. Jerome's in Manchester, and this publishing house was specialized in translation studies literature, and I'm very sorry that they sold the publishing house to Routledge, because Routledge publishes all sorts of things, and St. Jerome's was really one of the very, very few specialized publishers. Okay, the place where the source text was published was West Germany. In 1984, we still had two Germanys, and it was West Germany. And between West and East, there was this wall, not only metaphorical, but also in reality. For the target text, it is a little bit difficult to establish where it will be read. So it is published in the UK, but as we will see in a few minutes, the place where the text will be read, and I hope it is also read in India, will be much wider than just the UK. The time was 1984. There was a second edition in 1991. It was unchanged except for a very brief forward to the second edition. The target text was going to be published in 2013. The genre of the source text was an introductory university textbook, and the same applies to the target text. Who are the addressees of the source text? Students and scholars of translation studies in Germany and German-speaking countries, or people elsewhere with excellent reading knowledge of German, because the text is rather difficult to read, even for native speakers of German. The target text will hopefully be read by students and scholars of TS in the English-speaking world, plus non-natives anywhere, except the Spanish-speaking, because they have their own translation, and the German-speaking world. So it's almost anybody interested in translation studies. The assumed author's intention was, in the first part of the book, written by Vermeer, to explain Scopus theory, and the second part, written by Katharina Reis, to illustrate the application of Scopus theory to the specific cases where functional equivalence, sorry for the typos, is expected. And the same applies to the target text. Okay, what does this mean for our translation strategy? The target text should be adequate to the profile derived from the interpretation of the translation brief. That is, it should fulfill the functions intended by the authors for the target audience. Okay? That means, according to my typology of translations, I need an instrumental translation, and the form should be equifunctional. I could also call it functional equivalence, but on text type level or genre level, I'm trying to avoid the term equivalence. This is why I call it an equifunctional translation. That is a target text that is adequate to the purpose of achieving the same functions as the source text. Okay, what is the situation? So let us look at what we call localization. And an instrumental equifunctional translation would also be a kind of localization. This means customizing things for a local audience in a process that involves taking a product and making it linguistically, technically, and culturally appropriate to the target locale where it will be used and sold. This is a definition by Esseling. Globalization is the process of international integration arising from the interchange of world views, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. Glocalization, then, would be the adaptation of a product or service specifically to each locality or culture in which it is sold. Now, there's a problem, as you can imagine. if I want people to adopt functionalism in translation practice and teaching all over the world, I have to globalize it, because I'm a kind of missionary in regarding functionalism, as you may know. So this is the situation of English as a global language. You see, this is where it is a native language, and the green has more or less 60 to 80% speakers of English and so on. You can see that apart from the Spanish-speaking world and parts of Africa, especially French-speaking Africa, you can almost say it's the whole world. So when we have to translate a textbook on translation, which so far is only available in German and Spanish, into English, where then is the target locale? The intended audience consists, as I've mentioned already, not only of native speakers of English, but also of people interested in TS who do not know German or Spanish and have a reasonable command of English, for example, as a foreign language, like myself. Since English is a global language, this audience can be regarded as global too. Okay, now I have decided to use the examples of the book as a case in point. So we have to ask ourselves at first, what is an example? Oops, sorry. In Greek, paradigma, in Latin, exemplum, is a subtype of the simile, that is, a comparison of two different objects that resemble each other at least in one aspect. And this aspect they resemble each other in is the tertium comparationis. And this also applies to an example. An example is therefore a rhetorical figure intended to support a hypothesis or an argument by illustrating a case or enumerating items which are representative of a group as a whole. Examples in a textbook, for example, are in-texts, included texts which are relatively independent, whose intended function may be different from that of the text in which they are embedded. Okay, what are the intended functions? As I said, the function itself will be determined by the receivers. I can only intend them to function in a certain way. If this is the definition of an example, which I have read already, we can say one of the functions is to illustrate. If I look up illustrate in the dictionary, it says to enlighten, to light up, to serve as an eye-opener, to make somebody see or realize something. And I would call this an appellative function. The example appeals to the readers or listeners to remember something. So, oh, yes, this is the reaction I want to see. Then, of course, as I said, as we see in the definition, it is one function is also to explain something, that is to define, to expound. And this belongs to the representational, or as I call it, the referential function. And finally, examples are metacommunicative. They refer to the communication. For example, I say, let me give you an example. And then I'm referring to my own communication, and this is what we call meta-communication. That is a secondary communication about how a piece of information is meant to be interpreted. And this is what we call with Roman Jakobson the fatigue function, and we could also call it the contact function because it establishes a contact between senders and receivers. Okay, so let us look at an example for the examples. The argument of the text is that signs signify something. And the example given in the original is this one. I read the English now because it's a relatively close translation. A broken twig by the wayside is intended to mean that someone passed by and left the twig for you to find the way, as in Boy Scouts games. So we see a comparison. This is something we also find in Boy Scouts games. And luckily, fortunately for the translator, Boy Scouts games are as common in English-speaking areas as they are, or at least used to be, in the German-speaking regions. Okay, so this is an illustrative example. It illustrates the hypothesis. Okay, and as a subfunction of the appellative function, the illustrative function relies on the ability and disposition of the receiver to remember something they have stored in their memories. Okay? If the receiver says, I'm not interested, I don't want to remember anything, then the example will not work. Okay? But I want to give examples which work, and therefore I have to think about, will this work with the target audience? Yes or no? And if no, I have to find something else. Okay, another example. This is about a term, lect. And Vermeer explains what he means by lect. By lect, we not only refer to national languages. For example, now the example in the German text, he is German and Spanish. In the English text, I said, why should I compare this to German? Because one thing I know about the audience is that they do not know German. So this is why I say, for example, English or Spanish, which we would call parallax, but also to subforms or lower ranks like dialects. Types of dialect include regional dialects or regiolects. Now, the original mentions 2 regional dialects of Germany. And Germans who read this, they sort of remember how they sound and how these dialects are used and who uses them. But of course, English-speaking readers will not be able to remember such things. This is why I give them another example, like Broad Yorkshire. Probably not all English speakers know what Broad Yorkshire sounds like, but I suppose you can imagine what it is. Social dialects or sociolects, excuse me. It is relatively early in the morning for me. Like the lect of the upper as opposed to the lower classes in Britain, for example, Cockney. This is the sociolect of ageless array. Idiolect is the language of an individual at a given point in time, and the original mentions 2 great authors of German literature, and I have the language of Shakespeare. Okay, so, and these are explanatory examples, as you can see. They explain the term, the technical term, lect. Okay, as a subfunction of the referential function, the explanatory function relies on shared knowledge between sender and receiver. If you don't know Shakespeare, anything about Shakespeare, this example will not work with you. And an appropriate balance between given and new information. So this is what we have with theme ream or topic comment, which you know from text linguistics. Okay, so if I look at these two examples I've given, I see that the reference, the object of reference they refer to, is important for the decision of how to translate them. So I'm looking at all these examples and I can classify. This is something Germans love doing, classification, according to the object of reference. And I can find some examples referring to general human experience and world knowledge. And I can say, okay, for a global audience, these will be fine. Then examples referring to factual knowledge of the German-speaking culture or the English-speaking cultures or third cultures compared to German. Third, examples referring to cultural knowledge, that is culture-specific forms of behavior, which some people call culture reams, either supracultural, which are known in all over the world, or of the German-speaking cultures, of the English-speaking cultures, or of third cultures, and in these cases, they're usually compared to German in the book. Then we have examples referring to linguistic knowledge, that is, knowledge of languages in metalinguistic contexts, language use in general, including translation, German, English, third languages in the book. We have Spanish, French, Portuguese, ancient Greek, Latin, and all sorts of things. Then in these cases, usually compared to German. And fifth, examples referring to translation-related knowledge. It is a textbook for translation scholars or students. And there we can find translation English-German or German-English, a third language into German, German into a third language, English into a third language, or Spanish German. Because Katharina Reis's favorite language was Spanish, we have, as is mine, we have quite a lot of Spanish examples. Okay, so let us look at a few examples again. Examples referring to general experience, like this one, for example. When you put your cold feet into warm water, the water will seem warmer than when putting your warm feet into water of the same temperature. You need not be German or English or Spanish or Indian. You will understand this example. So wonderful. Unfortunately, there are only a very, very small number of this kind of examples. And why is this? Because they are so general that they do not really appeal so much. Huh? The examples referring to the audience's own culture will be more appellative. Okay? So we have here examples in the original referring to factual knowledge of the German-speaking cultures, and these, of course, function best with the German-speaking audience. For example, we can see this. You may translate, but rarely interpret, from one lingua cultural stage to another. For example, now we have the examples, and the German text alludes to the Bible translation by Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but the old one, and the translation of a medieval epic poem into New High German. Okay, so New High German will not really be something English-speaking readers know. So this is why, again, we have adapted the examples, modernizing the King James Authorized Version of the Bible, which corresponds more or less to Luther's translation, same time, and translating a medieval epic poem into modern English. I have thought of, I did think of putting here, translating Beowulf into modern English. And then I thought, the authors could have used a specific epic poem, but they didn't, to make it more general, to allow more people to understand. So this is why I did the same thing and said a medieval epic poem, and everybody who knows any epic poem can imagine this being translated into the modern language. Okay, then we have examples referring to culturemes, that is culture-specific behaviors. In this case, the German text refers to English-speaking cultures. This is the example. In order to understand that it would be quite an unusual event if students of an American college were to join together in a happy and peaceful Christmas celebration. The reader has to be familiar with the usual rivalry and even enmity between freshmen and sophomores at American colleges. So in the German text, you have the English words in inverted commas. In English text, you don't need the inverted commas because you can expect the English-speaking readers to know what this means, okay? Then we have examples referring to language. And this is about different stages of the German language, which no English speaker could do anything with. And the translation, that was a bit difficult, but since I am so old, I remember that you used to say in Britain, I'm going to spend a penny if you wanted to go to Violet. And my Marina said, why don't you say, I'm going to the loo today? You wouldn't really use such a euphemism. Okay. So now looking at the three functions I have established for the target text. First, the phatic function. Examples are a specific type of text inserted in the main text, and as such, they have to be recognizable, permitting the reader to process them as examples. And the original text was published at a time when computers were not yet around 1984. And it was obviously had been written on an electric typewriter where you don't have many possibilities to mark the text. Now, I was more fortunate. I had my PC, and therefore I used conventional example markers which help to achieve this aim. Each example consisting of more than one line is introduced by, for example, and you know, oh, this is where the example starts. They are indented to the left, aligned to the right, single-spaced, and then the font reduced by 1 point compared to the main text. Okay? So this is very easy with a computer, and it was not possible with an electric typewriter at the time. Therefore, some examples are very long. They run over a page or even 2 pages, and you forget that you're reading an example. In my translation, I have even, it was quite a struggle with Mona Baker at the time. I have even insisted on putting a gray shadow behind these examples. So you're reading an example and you know all the time that you're still in the example. Short explanatory examples are introduced by e.g. or lexical indicators like such as or like. And since English academic writing is characterized by a higher frequency of phatic markers than German academic text, Therefore, static markers have been added in the target text, like direct forms of addressing the reader. You. Do you remember the first example when you put your cold feet into warm water? The German text didn't have any address to the readers. Inclusive first person plural, like let us assume or let us look at as an example, personal verb forms rather than passive voice, etc. And this belongs to the FATIC function because it makes the contact between sender and receiver easier. Okay, let's look at the referential function. We've seen this already. Priority of the referential function is in most explanatory examples and in those illustrative examples dealing with languages and cultures with which the audience cannot be assumed to be familiar. Okay, so there is no problem with references to target culture facts, that is English culture facts, behavior patterns, or to the target language. Okay, fine. Translator happy, no transfer, no transposition needed. Regarding examples referring to facts, culture, language use, etc. of a third culture, the referential function can be achieved if the target audience can be assumed to be familiar with a third culture. Or like in the US, you could say, yeah, many people are familiar with Spanish. Or if the context provides a comparison between the third culture and the target language world, or if it contains sufficient information. In all other cases, the balance between given and new must be adjusted to make the referential function work. So, example, reference to a source culture behavior pattern. This is a literal translation of the German. Somebody gives his girlfriend a bouquet of roses to express his love for her. Confer, let flowers speak, which was an advertising slogan in Germany in the 1970s, long time ago. As we see, the metaphorical use of the word language can be included in this features, the language of flowers. Now, I think, let flowers speak. This is not really an advertising slogan for English-speaking people. So what can I do? I have done a little bit of research, and the language of flowers of the Victorian era is something you can find with a small brief internet research. And then the example, the referential function should work. With the appellative function, we find that almost 54% of the examples of the original are intended to achieve an appellative function, usually in addition to a referential function, but the appellative is the most important. It should appeal. It should make people say, oh, yes, I see. So, general human experience works. They are also appellative for the target audience. Reference to general or supracultural factual or behavior knowledge are also appellative to the target audience. Oops, sorry. References to factual and cultural knowledge about the German-speaking world and the German language are not appellative, but only referential for the target audience. So the function changes unless the translator does something about it. References to third language cultures contrasted with German language and culture are not appellative, but referential for target audience. They can only say, okay, now I know what Portuguese-German translation is like. But this does not really make you see anything. reference to translations from English into German are not appellative, but referential for the target audience if they are expanded in the context, okay? Like this one, ancient Greek from the Odyssey. This is a literal translation of the German text. She folded and smoothed the tunic and hung it on a peg beside the bedstead. And the translator again was lucky because an English translation of this text has the same problem. The authors argue that if you fold a tunic and then hang it on a peg, it unfolds again. So something is wrong here with the coherence of the example. And this is quite fortunate. So the German translation could be simply replaced by an existing English translation. Okay? In a translation, the appellative function would be lost in all examples referring to the source language and culture, because it is replaced by a referential function. However, an appellative function would be gained in examples referring to the target language and culture, which are only referential in the source text. Okay, looking at the whole picture, we can say if I translate the original as it is, the original examples as they are, the German text for German readers has almost the same amount, a little more illustrative examples than explanatory. If I translate the examples as they are in the source text, I will have a huge majority of explanatory examples and only very few illustrative examples. With my strategy of globalization, I have not been able to make all appellative examples appellative, but at least quite a lot of them, 112 compared to 158, okay? One example was omitted because it was a comment on the etymology of a German word, of a German term, which is not really very effective for an English-speaking audience, okay? I come to my conclusions. All examples are intended to achieve a phatic function, that is, to create a positive learning environment and stabilize the sender-receiver relationship. In my translation, the phatic function is marked more consistently by verbal and non-verbal function markers in line with target culture conventions in order to make it more effective. The classification of the corpus examples according to the knowledge field to which they refer resulted in a typology which was used to identify the intended functions of the different types of example and to design a coherent translation strategy for each function. Examples referring to German language are best suited to achieve not only a referential but also an appellative function for German readers, whereas examples referring to English language and culture are best suited to achieve an appellative function for English-speaking readers. The translation uses various strategies to account for these functional aspects. Wherever possible, references to German language and culture were replaced by references to English language and culture, and German translations of third language texts were replaced or complemented by English translations, either published or sometimes also my own. Of course, as is the case for the source text, there is no guarantee that the text will actually achieve the functions intended by the author or the translator, because it is the receivers who decide whether or not a text works for them. My aim was to show, however, that the functional strategy designed before embarking on the translation task helps the translator solve a particular translation problem in a systematic way, in our case, the translation of examples. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am, for that vivid.
I'm just getting this
Thank
away.
you, ma'am,
Then
for
where
that
are you?
vivid talk. Thank you,
Yeah.
ma'am, for that vivid talk on translation. We'll have the discussion of the talk after both the special address and the keynote address. We request you would kindly wait for the same.
The webinar team apologizes to Professor Hassan Said Ghazala for the inconvenience caused to him. And we are moving to the abided.
Sorry, I've done something wrong here. I have done something wrong.
We are once again apologize to Professor Hassan Said Ghazala for the inconvenience caused to him. Moving to the abided keynote address, we are proud to have with us the eminent scholar of translation and stylistics, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala, Department of English, College of Social Science, Al Qura University, Makkah Al Mukarram, Saudi Arabia. He was contributed immensely in the field of translation, and he has more than 30 books, 55 papers, including 3 dictionaries and 11 volumes of Encyclopedia of Translation textbooks in his credit. First Arabic Encyclopedia 2020, Styles of Speaking in Arabic 2020 are few of them. He was awarded with Sheikh Ahmad Award of Translation and many more. We cordially invite Professor Hassan Said Ghazala to deliver the keynote. Thank you.
Professor, we request Professor Noor to kindly stop sharing her screen.
Yeah, I have done something wrong here. I don't see the screen anymore. Just a minute.
It might be on top of your screen.
Trying to find you again.
Could you kindly search your taskbar, please?
I have no idea what happened here.
It's okay, ma'am.
I'm very sorry. Could you please ask your questions in the chat and I will answer them later?
We kindly request you to wait, since we have our keynote address now. We'll have the discussion soon after. We request you to wait, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. And if you allow me to pay a penny to it.
Thank you so much.
Professor Hassan Said Ghazala, sir, you can start your lecture. Thank you. Once again, moving to the awaited keynote address, we have with us the eminent scholar of translation and stylistics, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala, Department of English, College of Social Science, Al Qura University, Al Mukarram of Saudi Arabia. He has contributed immensely in the field of translation, and he has more than 30 books, 55 papers, including 3 dictionaries and 11 volumes of Encyclopedia of Translation textbooks in his credits. First Arabic Encyclopedia 2020, Styles of Speaking in Arabic 2020, some are few. He was awarded with Sheikh Ahmad Award of Translation and many more. With immense pleasure and courtesy, we invite Professor Hassan Said Ghazala to
So we request you to unmute yourself. So we can see that you're talking, but you haven't unmuted yourself, sir. Kindly unmute yourself.
Right. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Assalamu rahmatullah.
Right. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Hello and good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? It's all right?
Yes,
Can
we
you hear
can,
me,
we can hear you,
Isa?
sir. Yes. Go on, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Well, first, many thanks to the organizers of this webinar. I was really honored by their invitation, and I'm really very pleased to join this sort of gathering and great gathering, great celebration, actually. Thank you very much for everybody who has contributed to this webinar. I go straight away to the topic, the main topic of my talk today, which is translation theory, facts of theorization and theoretization. Facts and fallacies of theorization and theoretization. There has been an accumulation of a huge corpus of theorization about translation under the superordinate conception of translation theory. Yet, a substantial part of this theorization is mere theoretization, rather, that has caused a considerable damage to translation theory. So, a distinction between the two terms is urgently due. Theorization, on the one hand, is neutral in sense, which means, by definition in general, the suggestion of ideas about what is possible, what is possibly true, and more specifically, the formulation, speculation, production of a theory or theories. Right? Now, theoretization or theorization, on the other hand, is an elaborated, overdone fantasy, impractical, and untrue in translation, and with the pretext of developing it, it aims at creating. So again, on the other hand, theoretization or theorization, on the other hand, is an elaborated, overdone fantasy, impractical, and untrue theorization. In translation, and with the pretext of developing it, it aims at creating confusing, ambivalent situations and conflicting hypotheses in translation theory. This presentation is a comparative study drawn between genuine theorization and theorization for the sake of theorization. The study rounds up with a decisive conclusion that a flexible, practice-based translation theory should be dismantled of theoretized arguments that have to be ignored and challenged drastically in the daily practice of translation with confidence the world over. Repercussions of theoretization on translation theory and practice. Theoretization is an old-age practice in almost all types of theory. However, being an interdisciplinary subject, translation theory has suffered most from hollow theoretization. especially recently. It caused a great deal of damage to and cast doubt on translation theory in general with respect to its credibility, firmness, consistency, systematicity, institutionalization, and applicability. Statements like translation is impossible, culture is untranslatable, language is all in all cultural, translation theory is prescriptive fashion, translators are traitors, etc., are ludicrous indeed, aimed at subverting translation theory from within by way of allegedly updating it. In fact, the annihilation of translation theory cannot develop anything. Take, for example, the infamous statement by famous proponents of culturalizing language, Vermeer, Snell Hornby, Robinson and company, that language is all in all culture, and culture is untranslatable, so by implication translation is impossible to many of them, stated actually in Snell Hornby's book, 1988, 22-42. One, this is a fallacy that is too far from reality in practice and is dismissed by the fact that translation persists and will persist so long as there is life on earth. Therefore, to be more practical in our argument for the possibility of translation and at the same time the impracticality of the allegation of the impossibility of translation, we may pose the following questions as a tester. If to all these questions, if the answer to these questions is yes, the impossibility is a fallacy. If no, it is a fact. The first question, is translation today a fact of life? Is translation today a well-established discipline? Is translation today a recognized profession practiced the world over? Are there today professional translators everywhere? Are there today translation colleges, centers, institutions, departments, and courses all over the world? Are there today published translations of all types into other languages all over the world? Are bookstores and libraries full of translations? As also Rojo 209, page 26 points out, is 4,000-year-old practice enough to justify its possibility and legitimacy? And even again, is the publication of translation today prosperous? Are translations and interpretation today going on daily on the mass media, the website, and communication of all types, and at local, national, and international level? Are translation and interpretation today indispensable? Do we understand the House of Commons? Now, English Arabic, مجلس العموم البريطاني, Superman, the British Council, المركز الثقافي البريطاني, put the cart before the horse, تضع العربة أمام الحصان. This is your funeral. جنبك على جنبك. The Japanese kimono, الكيمون رداء نسائي تقليدي ياباني. Do they understand سوق عكاظ? Do they understand الكعبة؟ كعبة، مناسك الحج، the Hajj rituals, or مناسك الحج, Hajj rituals, العرض, jealousy for women, ألف ليلة وليلة, the Arabian Nights, أيام العرب في الجاهلية, the famous days of the pre-Islam Arabs, سوق عكاظ, pre-Islam Ukaz Poetry Festival. Isn't it the case that translation is not just one-to-one equivalent practice, Is translation today continuing to exist, generally at the age of high tech and sophisticated electronic communications of all types? Is it easier to understand and accept the culture of the other? Absolutely, yes. At least to me, yes. Hence, my book entitled Translating Culture, which I had it published in 2015. Textbook about translating culture, English, Arabic, Arabic, English. And I found out that it is absolutely possible to translate all cultural terms of any kind through three major strategies, so to speak. Adoption, either adoption, reconciliation, or clashing. And we have solutions to these problems. Every time we have a problem, we have solutions, whether this problem is cultural, political, linguistic, stylistic, whatever. Now, the counter attitude toward the translation of culture is based on the principle of language universals, suggested by Chomsky and the School of Generative Grammar. Ironically enough, this view was originally propagated by Humboldt, Wolff, and Sapir, who were the originators of the relativity theory. It seems that these views are good for translation as a middle ground between two: an overstated relativity or particularity, in other words, culture, and an overemphasized determinism or universe. I have a point here about universal and culture. Certainly, language is not all culture. Now, we have so many words, so many expressions, so many terms, as we all know, that are not cultural. Simply because we are human beings. We are created by God, the Almighty, one God. And we have so many things common among us. So how can we say everything is political? Everything is cultural. We may culturalize many things. They use so many things, but not everything. Now, we always come across expression, phrases, actually books, whole books, which may have only just maybe 1% or maybe 5%, maximum, as I mentioned here, 10 to 15% cultural text, specific cultural texts are of course excluded. We have so many kinds of types of text, and we translate without this background that everything is cultural, and we have to transfer it, change it, or maybe transform it in a way or another into the target culture. So I conclude here about culture. Therefore, we have to admit publicly that culture is a huge problem of translation. Yet, cultural terms and expressions are translatable by means of many translation tools, procedures, techniques, or tactics, however difficult and inconsistent that may be. Fallacies of theoretization vis-a-vis facts of theory of translation. Like any other set theory, and to be called a theory, translation theory is expected to be consistent, systematic, logical, rigorous, transparent, applicable, and above all, practice-based and practice-oriented. Any theory that fails to meet these prerequisites is incompetent, with the realization of the fact that no theory of translation or other is infallible, though. So latest developments of translation theory, a type of fallacious anti-theory trend, of theoretization has overwhelmed it in an attempt to spoil the apple cart, as it were, casting doubts on almost everything at the heart of translation, discipline, and theory, including the word translation itself. They introduce theses and antitheses. Yes, they introduce theses and antitheses. Yes, page 2. They introduce theses and antitheses that resist any kind of synthesis on the ground in translation practice. These aim at disrupting or perhaps annihilating the whole body and framework of translation theory. Whether their antagonistic protagonists mean it or not, that is, they say something and deny it later on, as we will see in a minute. Defend it and then attack it. Call for it and at the same time discard it, and so on and so forth. Following are 5 major theoretized contentions. Only 5. I have picked up only 5 because of time, and of course we can't have all contentions and concepts, or maybe theses and antitheses discussed here. The first one is descriptivism versus prescriptivism. Churi, who is the fanatic supporter and maybe initiator, I can't be sure that he is the godfather of descriptive approach to translation, upset linguistics-based studies of translation by opposing prescriptivism, as Pym in 2016 states, refusing prescriptive statements indicated by the recurrent use of should, for instance, by authors such like Peter Newmark, who said these statements were criticized sharply, such statements in his book, well-known book, Textbook of Translation. He said, statements like, in principle, in authoritative and expressive text should be translated. Translations should aim. Translators should translate. So, Churi cites this example as an example of prescriptivism in translation theory, and by translation theorists and major translation theorists, prominent translation theorists like Peter Newmark. Well, comments on descriptivism and prescriptivism. The same style of prescriptivism is adopted by Churi himself when talking about the view of a descriptive translation studies. He insists that, look, translation should be studied. Translation should be regarded. This proposition should be understood. The same style criticized by him, used by Peter Newmark. Again, Churi himself, who describes translation studies as descriptive, admits that it is prescriptive, for the descriptive paradigm has not been able to impose its disciplinary map on all other paradigms, and that the proponents of description were not entirely closed to the rest of the world. Descriptions do not help us in the training situation, as we'll see later on talk about norms. How can we translate students who are given translation from scratch for the first time? How can we train them without giving them real rules, principles, guidelines, etc.? Churi's paradigm is secular and requires criteria. This is a criticism by Pym and other proponents approaches to translation. On the other hand, If the descriptive approach is adopted in translation theory in the sense of describing how translations translate, how can translation theory develop and improve? Description of the status quo of current translations will be a standstill situation that may not achieve progress as hoped for. More to that, and as the February 1992 notes, the descriptive approach was not very useful when it came to decide what good translation is and what is bad. So if we don't decide, if we don't distinguish between good translation and bad translation, so what's the benefit of any approach of any approach or of any theory? Above all, and as Pim also rightly inquires, if the aim of the descriptive approach of translation studies were merely to describe, there would be little need for any grand theory. Then finally, despite the emphasis on description, this remains very much a paradigm for theoretical activity. In other words, description of translation corpus is a mere description and cannot be a theory, for if we describe a text or anything else, we are not forming a theory, but giving an account of specific features of certain type of the text or the thing described in our terms. Now, the second major contention is discarding translation norms. Descriptivist theoreticians, led by Churi, call for renouncing norms of translation. They shun any kind of rules, systems, regularities, principles, and guidelines in translation theory. They are anti-canonists, so to speak. Now, we, as it were, refusing to recognize any framework or reference of translation theory with the pretext that anything related to norms of translation would be prescriptive related to the previous point. And prescriptivism is, of course, discarded by descriptivists. Translation norms to Churi and company are there just to be broken and not to be followed. Now, commenting on discarding translation norms. A descriptive approach is useless and inapplicable in translation training for what to describe to trainee translators and translation students who start from scratch and have no background knowledge about translation. So prescriptivism is inevitable. Again, Churi's proposal 1992 to train students how to break norms. Look, not to train students how to know, how to learn students norms, how to break norms. How to break norms is a training, in a training situation, is inapplicable. For in what way are they going to be trained to break the norm of translating, and what for? Above all, in the first place, how will they break something they don't know about? So they will be taught, according to Churi, how to break the norms of translation. So when they know, first about these norms, according to the recent sociological perspective of translation, a translator resorts to social norms. So again, norms from outside, of course, and this is, of course, one of the recent approaches to translation, sociological approaches to translation. They resort to social norms. Norms, again, should be there. Number 3, translation. Descriptivists who call for disposing of translation norms admit that the aim of translation studies is to discover laws. The aim of translation studies is to discover laws. One may ask, aren't laws strict norms? Not only norms, strict norms. You talk about laws, you talk about norms. So laws are stronger in authority, stronger in prescriptivism, so to speak. Further, Churi contradicts himself again and again by maintaining that the concept of norms has helped bridge some of the gaps between descriptivism and prescriptivism. This is what, again, the concept of norms has helped bridge some of the gaps between descriptivism and prescriptivism. In her book, our distinguished Professor Christian Nord, her book Text Analysis in Translation, published in 1991 and translated into English in 1993. Professor Nord suggests a didactic approach to teaching translation. Part of it was actually included in her show, to teach translation in the classroom. That aims to what? To provide criteria for the classification to all text types for translation classes, and some guidelines, look, criteria, the line, guidelines for assessing the quality of the translation. In his review of the book in 1993, Pym concludes that the book should be of extreme interest to anyone seeking a solid basis for the training of translators. The book also includes a series of theoretical principles. In its first part, Pym rightly states that the approach is nothing if not systematic. Norms again. So as you see, Professor Nord and Pym use criteria, guidelines, solid basis, theoretical principles, systematicity. So in other words, both actually, of course, norms are included there in these concepts. That's why we need norms in translation, be they prescriptive or not. Now, after all, what is wrong with having well-established norms of translation? Don't we have norms of language, norms of conventions of reading literature, norms of critical discourse, norms of living, norms of research, norms of almost everything? Take, for example, language. How can we speak, read, or write any language in the world without norms and rules? If I address the webinar now using broken English, for example, is it normal? Of course not. And if, for instance, we have something, I would like just to turn the picture, please, the picture to this, if possible, please. Is it possible to? Yeah, please. Can you see? Can you send me the camera? To this this text. Yeah, can you hear me? Hello. Hello.
Yes, Professor.
You are here. Where? Look, this text is written in non-English alphabet. Can, for instance, NAC. If I, as you see, this is a riddle. If you can't read this text, you will, they say here, if you can't read this text, if you can read this forward, as you see, everything is, confused. Can, the N is first, then C, it's then A. So we conclude from this that norms of language are impossible. Language has rules and norms to organize and systematize itself in use so that its speakers can learn it through these rules and norms. Otherwise, how can we learn any language or anything without rules and norms? By the same token, if translation is without norms, chaos will prevail. Just imagine that there are no translation methods, no text type, no guidelines for the process of translating, no account of translation tactics, tools or procedures or approaches or strategies, and how and when to employ them. in translation, no ethics of translation strategy and how, when, no approaches to translating the different sides of text language, no account of translation problems and the solutions of different sides in different texts and contexts for different target language readership, no distinguish or recognition of variations and differences between SL and TL readers, no knowledge of the dynamics and pressures of the SL and TL etc. Imagine any people translate the way whatever they wish without knowing anything about rules and guidelines of how, what, when, where, why, what for, to what purpose, to who, and in what way to translate. Finally, imagine that there is no translation norms or translation theory at all. I guess it is very hard to imagine that. Oddly and vaguely enough, in the descriptive paradigm, the borders between translations and non-translation. So the major move to the third major contention, casting doubts on the meaning of translation. Here is another theoretical problem that cuts the heart of holotheoretization. That is casting doubts on the definition of the old age meaning of the term translation. If so, exactly what criteria should we use for collecting a set of things called translations? Two solutions. Signed of his book about this. The two solution to the problem has been to leave the use of collecting a set of things called translation. Two solution to the problem has been to leave the redefinition of the well-known term of translation to the people they study it. For him, a translation is presented or regarded as such on whatever grounds. Comments on this, it goes without saying that challenging the general meaning and definition of the term translation is an extremist contention put forward by Turing. He has gone too far to leave the meaning of translation to the people, communities, and cultures to be determined by each of them. In other words, he means to dismiss everything, to dismiss giving any definite meaning to translation, which can be taken as a call for liquidating the whole discipline altogether. Vagueness is looming again and again. A further strong objection to this illogical is raised by contemporary translation theorists who say that solution remains fraught with logical difficulties. For example, if each language has different words for translation, how do we know those words are translations of each other? In other words, in order to select the meaning of the words, we would surely need our own concept of translation. Put differently, it is unacceptable to question the meaning of translation, which has been practiced for thousands of years all over the world. The fourth major contention again is target side priority. Priority is given by descriptivist to the target language. You can do anything with the source language text for purposes, for the any kind of objection or aim or purpose the translator finds appropriate for the TL readers. Of course, scope theory is part of this, but so as you point of criticism about this, to be just target language, or everything is target language oriented. And for any purpose, then to use the source text as a means in the service of target culture, to the target culture, regardless of any respect to or considerations of the source text. To me, this is a clear invitation to rob and betray the source text and blast basic principles of translation of faithfulness, honesty, and accuracy. I don't mean faithfulness should go always to the SL text, of course. But of course, we have basics, we have principles. They are broken here according to Chori and other descriptive theoreticians. Others have objected to the separation of the two cultures, SL, TL, arguing that translators, especially literary translators. More generally, as with the problem of defining translation, the binary opposition of source and target determinist product. And number 4, the scope is dethroning the source text and crowning the target text unjustifiably and unethically at the expense of the source text. And this is again in PIM 2016. The fallacy of equivalence is a chimera. This is the last major contention we all know about. Snell-Hornby called linguistic equivalence an illusion, a chimera. She said, the term equivalence, apart from being imprecise and ill-defined, presents an illusion of symmetry between languages which hardly exist beyond the level of vague approximation and which distort the basic problems of translation. 1988, 22, many of you I'm sure know that. Descriptivist theoreticians oppose the equivalence paradigm in that they aim to be non-prescriptive. Their prime focus is on shifts rather than type of equivalence, and they do not undertake extensive analysis of the source culture. They tend to be like purpose-based scoreboard approaches in that they emphasize the target culture, context, and the function of translation within that context. To them, equivalence went out of fashion, and German language scope theory made it even more unfashionable by arguing that since functional consistency, the closest thing they had to equivalence, was no more than one of many possible requirements, translation usually requires transformations of a rather more radical kind. Objection to this. Number 1, contrary to Snell-Hornby's controversial statement and other antagonists of equivalence, including prescriptivist theoreticians, equivalence is not a mirage. I mean, descriptivist theoretician. Equivalence is not a mirage, but rather an inescapable reality that is widespread in use by translation theorists and practitioners when talking about translation. As Roger said, the word equivalence, or later on everyone's lips, whether we like it or not. And Roger actually says that, 209, page 31. Thus, equivalence is a reality in translation theory and practice. It is so easy to see ourselves and turn blind eye to a glaring fact, like equivalence in translation, and believe in heresies and fallacies that we have falsely, innocently convinced ourselves of. Equivalence is always hovering over the heads of the translators. Any translators in the world, for they are always they're always preoccupied. This is the fact. With rendering the SL meaning into the TL as closely as possible by several means, tools, and tactics. It is true that there are exceptions to the practice, but exceptions are exceptions. Number 3, there are many approaches to translation and translation methods in circulation these days. All of them are based mainly on the concept of equivalence. However, with variation. Equivalence is not taken here in the sense of one-to-one correspondence between the source language term and its target language counterpart. Equivalence should be understood in a relative sense as the closest approximation possible to the meaning of the Rojo. Different types of equivalence have been in circulation in translation theory today. There have been so many literal equivalents, free equivalents, linguistic equivalents, sociolinguistic equivalents, referential equivalents mentioned by not cultural equivalents, pragmatic equivalents, non-pragmatic equivalents, stylistic equivalents, connotative equivalents, denotative equivalents, figurative, idiomatic, direct, indirect, formal, dynamic, communicative, functional, textual, etc. So many. So equivalence is there. We can classify it in terms of the type or a proximity or proximity principle, etc. Now, suppose, number 4, suppose we drop equivalence from translation. What is the alternative then? Functional consistency. What does this term exactly mean? It is quite misleading and disillusioning to devise alternatives such as this one by descriptive approaches and practices that are unrealistic, impractical, and lack elaboration. Equivalence has been and will continue to be a hard fact for almost everybody in the field that resist any attempt to dethrone it from the, I'm about to finish, theory and practice of translation, as well as from the mind of translators. If we may claim consensus for a term, concept, or practice in translation theory, it must be equivalence. Conclusions. To conclude, translation theory is far from perfect, yet it is there with basics, guidelines, regularities, norms, methods, methodologies, process of translating, ethics, tools, procedures, techniques, and tactics that are flexible and changeable over time and may vary from one language to another, from one culture to another, text to text, readership to readership, and even from translator to translator. So it is not exactly prescriptive and stagnant in the negative strict sense of the word, as some theoreticians claim. This study is an appeal for translation theorists and practitioners to challenge some new trends in translation studies by some of its advocates. By the way, translation studies is meant to replace translation theory. And to me, this is a kind of dethroning translation theory, and it is not recognized as really a theory. And translation, because we have linguistic studies inside or under linguistic theory. So why call translation theory, translation studies, not theory? So I believe this is again another attempt by recent theoreticians to maybe uproot translation theory altogether and replace it with translation study, which is not exactly a theory. And we, of course, do not accept that in any way. By some of its advocates advocates of translation studies, who aim to disrupt the whole body of translation theory and practice and destabilize them by casting doubts on all conceptions, approaches, activities, and basics in the field, to replace them with baseless contentions and hypotheses. Only a well-established theory of translations can be tolerated, be it prescriptive or otherwise. That is the natural way of all aspects of human life and good theories, including translation theory. Finally, I think we have to stop being dumbfounded, rushing blindly and innocently to any new trend in translation theory for two main reasons. It may be theoretization, and second, we are not readily destined or deemed to believe anything new, no matter who is or how or authorized he or she might be. They may mean to baffle us in the name of new developments in translation theory. Thank you very much for listening. I have been too long. I couldn't actually cut the article shorter, Thank you very much for bearing with me. Thank you for everybody.
We express our sincere gratitude to Professor Hassan Said Ghazala for the thought-provoking words. And dear delegates, now the two keynote lectures are open for discussion. First 10 minutes for each lecture, and we would like to begin with Professor Noor. You may unmute yourself, or you can use the chat box and you can interact with Christina and Noor for 10 minutes. After, we will move to Professor Hassan Ghazala. Thank you. Ma'am, you may unmute.
Professor Nord?
Yes.
Professor Nord, do you hear us? Professor Christiana Nord, do you hear
Yeah.
us? Yeah. Now,
Yeah, do you hear me?
Delegates, you can interact with Professor Noor. Only 10 minutes available, so please make it fast. You can use either chat box or you can unmute yourself. Delegates, please use this opportunity. You can interact to Professor Notes.
They can unmute themselves.
Yeah.
hello. Hello, excuse me, Professor Nord.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Isa speaking to you, and thank you for being with us, and we appreciate it that you have accepted our invitation. And yeah, I have got your question, ma'am, which is like, ma'am, is it very important for practicing translators to know or to have the knowledge of translation theory? Because nowadays we know that we have a lot of practicing translators who have no knowledge of translation theory, and they feel like that translation theory is a kind of confusing. Then why do we need translation theory? What is your take on that, please?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think, yes, they do need translation theory in order to know what they are doing. So some people do intuitively the right thing, but they don't know why it is the right thing. And they wouldn't be able to repeat this the next time. And they wouldn't be able to defend their translation decisions against criticism of their clients, for example. And this is why we teach translation theory and methodology to students, to trainees, in order to make them aware of what they are doing and what to evaluate the different solutions they can think of and say, what happens if I take this solution? What will happen if I use the other solution? If they don't know anything about theory, they wouldn't have the tools, the concepts to talk about translation. See? And I think that it is necessary to give them a little portion of, to the students, a little portion of theory before they start translating. And then more and more when they go on translating. So theory and practice have to be interwoven, not theory only and not practice only, but practice has to be supported by theory and practice feeds into the theory. I think it has to be a practice-oriented theory, not abstract. Yeah, does this answer your
Yes,
question?
ma'am.
a
Yes,
little
yes,
bit?
yes, Professor. Thank you so much. Now we have someone who would like to ask you, someone called Muhammad Tagyan. So you are unmuted. Please, you can speak.
Thank you, Professor Nord, for this very interesting talk and presentation, and I'm very happy that to hear from you. Your theory was my PhD is based, so I did my PhD. Thank you very much for this. This is Muhammad Tagyan. I'm working as an assistant professor of applied linguistics and translation at Taiba University, Saudi Arabia, and I live in Manchester, the UK. Thank you for this. I have a question regarding the presentation that you've just given now. It's about, is the brackets open-ended for the purpose of the translator who is going to translate everything? So he's going to be another author. If something like this, so I might going to give more explanations, more annotation, more annotated parts for this that we are going to add for the text, for the source text, and regarding, especially regarding the religious texts, which is very sensitive, addition or adding for some purposes, for explanation, yes, might be one explanation is accepted, another explanation is not. So I'm just asking about the limitations of addition, about the limitation of the translation of the translator. So if you, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the translator is not an author in the sense that she creates something new, but she is the author's mouthpiece. So in the target culture, so because the author cannot really communicate directly with the target culture, he or she uses the translator as their mouthpiece. So as a mouthpiece, I try to find out what the author wants to say or to do, and I try to make this work in the target culture. Referring to my talk, I can say, okay, the author wants to give an example to make people see the argument, for example, to make people say, yeah, source culture audience. They think, oh, not all the examples in the book work right now. They were first published in 1984. And students in 2020 sometimes cannot really make sense of the example, even in the German text, because times have changed and they don't know about what this is. So this is why authors often give 2 or 3 examples to make sure at least one works. Okay? And this is the same thing that I, as a translator, am doing. So where are the limitations? Oh, you were referring to sensitive religious texts. I have been a translator of New Testament biblical texts myself, so I know what you're talking about. And I think the limitations are in loyalty. As you know, functionalism, or to make a text work, function, is one thing, one pillar of my theoretical approach. The other pillar is loyalty. What does this mean? In the communicative cooperation between author, audience, target audience, translator, client, etc., the translator is the only one who knows both sides, the source and the target side. This is part of their translation competence, and or should be at least. And therefore, translators have this responsibility with regard to A, the author, B, the target audience, C, the client, and perhaps D, themselves. When I translate, say, a letter by St. Paul, I don't want to wake up in the night having a nightmare, St. Paul saying, "You falsified my letter to the Corinthians." I want to feel loyal towards the author, but of course, also with regard to the target audience, because they trust me that I'm doing a good job. They want to understand this book by Reis and Femia because it is so famous. And they trust me. Oh, I'm sorry, the doorbell is ringing now. I have to open the door. Just a second, bear with me. I'm so sorry. I thought I would be finished by by now, and I have a visitor yet now. But you see, the limitation is loyalty. Loyalty with regard to everybody involved, and I think this is an ethical aspect, which is always important if you deal with people. You're not dealing with a text. Text is dead material, but you're dealing with people, and they have to trust you. Okay, you have to trust your client that they will pay your fee afterwards, but the client and the target audience and the author have to trust the translator, because otherwise there won't be any cooperation. Is that clearer now?
Yeah.
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I hope it is clear. Anyway, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for adding more colors to our webinar with your presence and enriching our knowledge.
I'm very sorry, I do have to leave you now.
Yeah, thank you once again.
A very, very nice continuation of your webinar.
Thank you, ma'am.
Pop in later and listen to one or two talks, but I'm not sure now. I don't have the time now. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank
Bye,
you for
bye,
adding,
everybody.
thank you for adding more colors to our webinar and enriching our knowledge. And we are moving to Professor Hassan Gesala. Dear delegates, may unmute yourself and ask your questions to Professor Hassan Gesala. Thank you. 10 minutes time for raising your questions, clarifying your doubts. Please.
All right, go on, please.
Someone, Magda Madkur, already have raised her hand. And Hasina, you can unmute yourself and ask questions. Okay. Magda, you can ask question.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor, for your informative and very interesting presentation and beautiful article. My question is regarding your discussion on translation theory and translation studies. To my understanding, translation studies are an attempt to link a translation to other discipline. For example, translation and sociology, translation and psychology, translation and maybe other literature, for example, criticism, etc. So in this case, they integrate translation theories with theories of linguistics, of sociology, of psychology sometimes. So why do you don't accept that? I didn't get your point regarding your rejection of translation is it a rejection of translation studies or of claiming that translation studies is a theory? To my understanding, it's not a theory. Okay, and just let me introduce myself, Magda Matkour, Associate Professor at Al-Imam University College of Languages and Translation. And we use your books a lot with our students and with my PhD and MA students. And they are very, very.
Thank you, Dr. Magda.
I'm not clear about
please.
this point.
Yeah, yeah, no, I understand what you mean. Look, any theory has studies, including the translation theory. So why do we go for translation studies? Don't we have linguistic studies under linguistic theory? We have studies, of course, everywhere. The translation is an discipline. It can, of course, sort of contact, link, or whatever with other fields of knowledge and theory. Yeah, so translation is right. I'm not objecting to translation studies there, of course, but why replace it now? Many would replace translation studies. I mean, would replace translation theory with translation studies. Why? Okay, we have translation studies inside, under the superordinate umbrella of translation theory. Why not? So why change translation theory into translation studies? This is my objection. And I find translation theory as I mean the umbrella term, the umbrella conception that subsume, among other things, translation studies. This is the point, and I don't object to translation studies as they are. No. And this is my point. And thank you very much indeed for your question. Well, I just actually have such kind of impression. Why do they want to uproot even the term translation theory, as they try to uproot the term translation, the definition of the term translation, which is almost on the everybody, but of course we have differences on how, on what, on when, etc. Okay, but translation is translation, and this is the point. Yes, Jazakallah khair.
Okay, sir, but I think the translation theories are actually based on linguistic theories.
They overlap. So then overlap. This overlap is acceptable when we have translation theory, linguistic theory, translation studies under translation theory. Yes, of course, linguistic theory and translation theory are inseparable in practice. Yes, you're right.
Sir, we kindly request you to shorten due to the time constraints.
Yes.
So we'll move on to, thank you so much, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala, for your valuable suggestions and discussion. We now move on to our felicitations. I warmly welcome the webinar coordinator, chairperson, School of Languages and head Department of English, Farouk College, Dr. Sajida M.A., to deliver her speech.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Respected convener of the webinar and president of this inaugural session, Professor S.A. Shanavas, Pro Vice Chancellor of University of Kerala, Professor P.P. Jayakumar, resource persons of the day, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala and Professor Christiana Node, our guests, Professor Kazim Muhammad Abbas, Professor Abdul Rahman Abdurrab, and Dr. K.M. Nasir, coordinators, Dr. S. Prema and Dr. Muhammad Al-Akili, webinar organizing secretaries, Mr. Isa Ali Muhammad and Dr. Ubaid. The School of Language and Literature, Farouk College, is very happy to collaborate with the University of Sana'a, Yemen, and the University of Kerala in organizing this 3-day seminar, 3-day webinar on translation. In today's world of Google Translation and instant translation, the webinar of this kind are really relevant. A program machined translation like Google Translation will fail to transfer the empathy which should be created through literature. Choosing the apt word in the apt context is very important. Translation fails when it ceases to be the journey of emotion from one text to the other. Translation fails when it ceases to convey the tone of the original text. When Professor Christina Nord was speaking about localization and globalization, I just traveled through my memory lane, translating a very important book, Methodology of Folkloristics, which is actually on a folklore theme. Initially, the work, when it was divided to the students of our department, some of the students translated the word mudi into hair. That is how the word is being translated. But later only we came to know that it is a total implication, and we had to visit the place. We've had a trip to the Vairajagan temple of Kannur to see how actually the ritual Theyyam is being performed. Otherwise, our translation would be equivalent to a Google translation. Today, when I sit in front of you in the virtual platform, I have this book in front of you. This is actually a book based on Theyyam, which is being translated by the Department of English, Farouk College. So, Professor Christina Nord actually made me travel through my memory lane, and the other person, the other resource person, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala's equivalence, the terms of equivalence, it was actually enlightened us. And it is very difficult to get an equivalent word also at times. Cousin is a very common word in English, but while translating the short story of Ngugi wa Thiong'o of the Upright Revolution, I was actually in search of a Malayalam equivalent to the word cousin, Malayalam equivalent of the word cousin. So we understand that there are a lot of limitations, and this kind of webinars are actually will enrich us. And on behalf of the School of Language and Literature, I would like to offer the best wishes to the seminar, the participants. I am sure that you will benefit from this 3-day webinar. And to conclude, I will quote the famous words of Gunnar Grass. Translation is that which transforms everything so that nothing changes. I repeat, translation is that which transforms everything so that nothing changes. With that, let me conclude, and I wish all the best to all the participants. Thank you very much, and it's real pleasure for the School of Language and Literature, Farouk College, to be part of the University of Yemen and the University of Kerala. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that inspiring talk. I now welcome the webinar coordinator, Assistant Professor
Can I
and...
say something, please?
Wait. Professor Ghazala, you would like to say something?
Excuse me.
Yes, yes, Professor Hassan Said Ghazala. Would you like to speak something?
Yeah, yeah. Can I say something, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Hello. Can I say something? All right. Now, thank you very much for the lady speaking. Thank you very much indeed. Just a general question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes,
sir.
we can hear you.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Just a general question asked to, Professor Nord, which is translation theory necessary for translating in practice? The answer is simply yes, but it will be like an imposter doctor who knows about medicine without knowledge of medicine, without studying medicine, without knowing the basics of medicine. Yes, I mean, translation theory is inevitable for good translators. So many translators, yes, translate without knowledge, even highly educated translators. Once I asked, a so-called professional translator, he translated actually several works, in literature. He had a PhD in literature. And I asked him this question: what method do you apply in your translation? Well, I was surprised when he told me, I don't know. I have no certain method. I have no idea about methods. I have no idea about procedures. Well, this is not acceptable from a professional translator. So we have many, sorry to say again, imposted translation knowledge, or about translation, or maybe knowledge at all, but they know maybe the two languages. They claim that they know the two languages. But how about, loyalty, betrayal, etc.? They know nothing about that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll now move on to the felicitation. I now invite Dr. Mohammed Al-Akili, the webinar coordinator, assistant professor and head in the Department of Translation, Faculty of Languages, University of Sana'a, Yemen.
Hello? Afternoon. You hear me?
Afternoon.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon, all gathered here, respected dignity online and here. It's my privilege to be one of the conference coordinators. This international conference that deals with the translation theories, tools, techniques, and strategies. I'd like to just to send my congratulations for preparing and launching such very great and considerable scientific activities in such difficult circumstances and time. As we always believe that translation break or trust the barriers between nations, cultures, and languages, we are today practicing this belief by crossing the and breaking the distances between us. I'm very appreciated for the attendance here and those prominent figures of translation who really need no introduction about them. Professor Abdurrahman Abdrabbo, Professor Christine Nord, and Professor Hassan Ghazal, and all the dignitaries attending today, practicing tomorrow and the day after. Finally, I wish all participants of this international conference, or virtual conference, to achieve relevant presentations, fruitful discussions, and reach valuable results and practical recommendations for the scholars of translation. Thank you very much for this chance to give my words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Valuable words.
Professor Hassan Ghazala, do you hear me, please?
Yes.
This is Isa speaking to you. Thank you for being with us, and we highly appreciate you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for your informative talk. Thank you so much. Barakallahu feek.
Thank you for all of you, especially you, and you have done a good job, and the organization is brilliant. And I am really the one to thank you because you invited me, and I was very, very grateful to you. I am really honored to great celebration, I call it. And thanks to God, to you, of course.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Everybody
you.
to be thanked, I mean, in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.